John Locke is widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers in the history of philosophy and political theory. His ideas on empiricism, government, and individual rights laid the foundation for modern democratic societies. Born in the 17th century, Locke lived in a time of political and religious upheaval, which deeply shaped his intellectual pursuits. His writings, particularly an essay concerning human understanding and two treatises of government, revolutionized the way people perceive knowledge, governance, and personal liberty. This dissertation aims to explore Locke's life, philosophical contributions, and his enduring legacy in shaping contemporary political and philosophical thought. The significance of John Locke's work extends beyond philosophy into the realms of politics, education, and religious tolerance. He is often credited as the father of liberalism, advocating for a government that derives its authority from the consent of the governed. His social contract theory influenced major political revolutions, including the American and French revolutions, which sought to establish societies based on individual freedoms and democratic principles. Furthermore, his arguments on religious tolerance paved the way for the development of secular governance, ensuring that no single religious authority could dictate public life. Locke's philosophy was deeply rooted in the intellectual traditions of the Enlightenment. He challenged the prevailing belief in innate ideas, arguing instead that human knowledge is derived from experience. This empirical approach opposed the rationalist perspective of philosophers like René Descartes, who believed that certain concepts existed in the mind from birth. By asserting that the human mind is a blank slate, tabula rasa, at birth, Locke revolutionized the study of epistemology and laid the groundwork for modern psychology and education. Understanding Locke's impact requires an exploration of the historical context in which he lived. The 17th century was marked by intense political conflict in England, including the English Civil War, the execution of King Charles I, and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. These events shaped Locke's views on governance, as he sought to establish a political philosophy that could prevent tyranny and ensure stability. His arguments for limited government, the protection of private property, and the right of the people to overthrow unjust rulers were direct responses to the political instability of his time. Locke's influence is particularly evident in the development of constitutional government. His two treatises of government provided the intellectual justification for the Glorious Revolution and the establishment of parliamentary sovereignty in England. His ideas later served as a foundation for the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution, particularly in the writings of Thomas Jefferson. By emphasizing natural rights, life, liberty, and property, Locke provided a moral framework for the creation of governments that prioritize individual freedoms. Another crucial aspect of Locke's philosophy is his advocacy for religious tolerance. In a letter concerning toleration, he argued that governments should not have the authority to impose religious beliefs on individuals. This was a radical position in an era when religious persecution was common, and it helped shape the modern principle of the separation of church and state. His belief that true faith cannot be compelled by force was a significant contribution to discussions on human rights and religious freedom. Despite the far-reaching impact of his work, Locke was not without his critics. Some philosophers, such as David Hume, challenged his ideas on empiricism, arguing that human knowledge is more complex than Locke's tabula rasa concept suggests. Others criticized his views on property rights, particularly regarding colonialism and land ownership. Nonetheless, his theories continue to be studied and debated, demonstrating their lasting significance in philosophical and political discourse. The purpose of this dissertation is to provide a comprehensive analysis of John Locke's life, major works, and lasting influence. Each chapter will explore different aspects of his contributions, from his early life and education to his political philosophy and views on religious tolerance. By examining both the historical and intellectual context of his work, this study aims to highlight the ways in which Locke's ideas have shaped the modern world. Locke's relevance extends beyond his time, as his principles continue to inform contemporary discussions on democracy, human rights, and governance. In an era where issues of political authority, personal freedoms, and state power remain central, his insights offer valuable guidance. By understanding Locke's philosophy, we gain a deeper appreciation of the foundations of modern society and the ongoing struggle to balance individual rights with governmental authority. John Locke was born on August 29, 1632, in the small village of Rington, Somerset, England. His upbringing took place during one of the most tumultuous periods in English history, as the country was on the brink of civil war. His father, also named John Locke, was a lawyer and a Puritan who supported the parliamentary forces against King Charles I. This background played a crucial role in shaping Locke's political philosophy, as he grew up in a household that valued individual rights, governance by consent, and opposition to absolute monarchy. Locke's early education was rigorous and deeply rooted in the classical traditions of the time. He was first tutored at home before attending Westminster School in London, one of the most prestigious schools in England. There, he studied Latin, Greek, and classical literature, subjects that were considered essential for intellectual development. Westminster exposed Locke to a curriculum steeped in traditional Aristotelian philosophy, but it also introduced him to the works of Renaissance thinkers who were beginning to challenge established doctrines. In 1652, Locke was admitted to Christ Church, Oxford, where he continued his education in philosophy, logic, and classical studies. At Oxford, he was introduced to the prevailing scholasticism of the time, which emphasized rigid adherence to ancient authorities like Aristotle. However, Locke found this traditional approach unsatisfactory and instead became interested in the emerging ideas of modern science and empirical observation. This intellectual shift would later form the basis of his contributions to epistemology and political theory. One of the most significant influences on Locke during his time at Oxford was the work of Francis Bacon, a philosopher known for advocating the empirical method. Bacon's emphasis on observation and experimentation over pure reasoning resonated with Locke, who began to question the dominant rationalist perspectives. In addition, Locke was exposed to the writings of René Descartes, whose rationalist philosophy contrasted with the empirical approach that Locke would later champion. These encounters set the stage for Locke's eventual rejection of innate ideas and his argument that all knowledge comes from experience. While at Oxford, Locke also developed a strong interest in medicine and natural sciences. He studied under the renowned physician Thomas Sydenham, who would later become a lifelong friend and influence. Sydenham's empirical approach to medicine, which emphasized careful observation and practical experience rather than abstract theorizing, further reinforced Locke's belief in empiricism. This medical training not only shaped his scientific outlook, but also played a role in his later political career, as his medical expertise made him a valuable advisor to influential figures. Despite his growing discontent with traditional scholastic philosophy, Locke remained at Oxford for many years, eventually earning a Master of Arts degree in 1658. During this time, he also became involved in teaching and research, focusing on subjects such as rhetoric, moral philosophy, and Greek. His academic work provided him with a strong foundation in logic and argumentation, skills that he would later use in his major philosophical writings. Locke's academic career took a turning point when he was introduced to Lord Ashley, later known as the Earl of Shaftesbury, in 1666. Ashley, a prominent political figure, recognized Locke's intellectual abilities and invited him to join his household as a personal physician and advisor. This relationship was transformative for Locke, as it brought him into direct contact with the political and intellectual elite of England. Through Ashley, Locke became involved in discussions on governance, trade, and economics, which would deeply influence his political writings. Locke's time with Shaftesbury exposed him to the complexities of government and policymaking. He witnessed firsthand the challenges of balancing authority with individual rights, and he became increasingly interested in questions of political legitimacy. During this period, Locke began to formulate many of the ideas that would later appear in two treatises of government, particularly his arguments for limited government, the protection of private property, and the right of people to overthrow unjust rulers. His education and early career experiences laid the intellectual groundwork for his later contributions to philosophy, politics, and science. Locke's exposure to both classical education and modern empirical thought allowed him to develop a unique perspective that blended tradition with innovation. His rejection of innate ideas, his emphasis on experience as the basis of knowledge, and his belief in the importance of limited government all stemmed from his formative years of study and observation. John Locke's transition from academia to professional life was marked by his increasing involvement in medicine, science, and political affairs. Although he was initially trained in classical philosophy, his growing dissatisfaction with traditional scholastic methods led him to explore more empirical approaches to knowledge. His medical studies, combined with his connections to influential political figures, played a crucial role in shaping his intellectual development. These early career experiences not only influenced his later philosophical works, but also provided him with practical insights into governance, economics, and human nature. Locke's medical career began in earnest during his time at Oxford, where he developed a keen interest in experimental science and anatomy. Under the mentorship of Thomas Sydenham, a leading physician of the time, Locke learned to prioritize observation and empirical evidence over abstract theory. Sydenham's approach to medicine, which emphasized careful clinical observation and the rejection of traditional dogma, resonated with Locke's own philosophical leanings. This influence reinforced Locke's belief in the power of experience and set the foundation for his later work in epistemology. Although Locke never formally qualified as a physician, he gained a reputation as a skilled medical practitioner. His practical medical knowledge became especially valuable when he entered the service of Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Earl of Shaftesbury, in 1667. Initially appointed as Shaftesbury's personal physician, Locke quickly became one of the Earl's most trusted advisors. His role in Shaftesbury's household provided him with direct exposure to high-level political discussions, allowing him to engage with key figures in English governance. One of Locke's most notable medical contributions came in 1675 when he successfully performed a life-saving operation on Shaftesbury. The Earl suffered from a severe liver condition that required surgical intervention. Locke supervised the procedure, demonstrating his competence in medical matters. This event strengthened the bond between Locke and Shaftesbury, securing Locke's position as an important political ally. More significantly, it allowed Locke to remain closely involved in English political affairs at a time when the country was undergoing significant changes. Beyond medicine, Locke's early career was characterized by his growing engagement with political and economic thought. Through his association with Shaftesbury, he became deeply involved in discussions on trade, property rights, and governance. These experiences influenced his later economic writings, where he argued for the protection of private property as a fundamental right. His belief that economic prosperity was tied to individual liberty and limited government intervention became a central theme in his political philosophy. Locke's involvement in political affairs also extended to his work with the Board of Trade and Plantations, where he contributed to policies regarding England's economic expansion. He played a role in drafting the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, a colonial charter designed to establish governance in the American colonies. Although this document was never fully implemented, it demonstrated Locke's early engagement with questions of law, governance, and human rights in a colonial context. His ideas on property rights, religious tolerance, and representative government were evident in his contributions to colonial policy. Despite his growing political influence, Locke's association with Shaftesbury also placed him at risk. Shaftesbury was a key opponent of King Charles II and played a leading role in the Exclusion Crisis, a political movement aimed at preventing the Catholic Duke of York, later James II, from ascending the throne. As tensions escalated, Shaftesbury's political fortunes declined, and he was eventually forced into exile. This turn of events affected Locke as well, prompting him to leave England for the Netherlands in 1683. Locke's exile proved to be a formative period in his intellectual life. While in the Netherlands, he immersed himself in the vibrant intellectual culture of Amsterdam, engaging with scholars, political thinkers, and religious reformers. This period of reflection and study allowed him to refine his ideas on government, knowledge, and human rights. It was during this time that he began work on an essay concerning human understanding and two treatises of government, two of his most influential works. Although his early career was marked by political uncertainty, Locke's experiences provided him with first-hand knowledge of the challenges of governance. His exposure to political decision-making, medical practice, and economic policy shaped his views on human nature and the role of government. Rather than relying on abstract philosophical theories, Locke's approach was deeply rooted in practical observation and experience. This empirical mindset became the foundation of his later philosophical and political arguments. John Locke's exile in the Netherlands from 1683 to 1689 marked a transformative period in his intellectual and political development. Forced to flee England due to his association with the Earl of Shaftesbury and the Whig opposition to King Charles II and James II, Locke found himself in a new environment that would significantly influence his philosophical ideas. The Netherlands, with its culture of religious tolerance, political liberalism, and intellectual vibrancy, provided Locke with the ideal setting to refine his theories on government, knowledge, and human rights. It was during this period that he began drafting his most influential works, laying the foundation for his lasting legacy. The immediate reason for Locke's exile was the failure of the exclusion crisis and the subsequent crackdown on Whig politicians and their allies. The Whigs sought to prevent the Catholic Duke of York, later James II, from ascending the throne, fearing that his rule would lead to religious persecution and absolute monarchy. After the unsuccessful Rye House Plot, an alleged conspiracy to assassinate Charles II and his brother James, Shaftesbury fled to the Netherlands, where he died in 1683. Locke, fearing for his safety due to his close association with the Whigs, also chose to leave England. Amsterdam, where Locke settled, was one of the most intellectually and politically open cities in Europe at the time. The Dutch Republic had established itself as a haven for religious refugees, political dissidents, and scholars from across Europe. The city's atmosphere of tolerance and debate provided Locke with the freedom to explore ideas that might have been dangerous in England. He engaged with a network of intellectuals, including Protestant reformers, philosophers, and political activists, who were also concerned with issues of governance and human liberty. During his years in exile, Locke devoted himself to extensive reading, writing, and correspondence with other thinkers. It was in the Netherlands that he began systematically working on an essay concerning human understanding, a project he had contemplated for years. This work sought to answer fundamental questions about the nature of human knowledge and understanding. Rejecting the idea of innate ideas proposed by rationalist philosophers like Descartes, Locke argued that all knowledge derives from experience. His concept of the mind as a tabula rasa, blank slate, upon birth became one of the most influential ideas in modern philosophy. Locke's time in exile also allowed him to refine his political ideas, which would later be published as two treatises of government. The first treatise was a direct refutation of Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, which defended the divine right of kings. Locke systematically dismantled Filmer's argument, rejecting the notion that monarchs derive their authority from God. Instead, he argued that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed, a radical departure from traditional justifications for monarchical rule. The second treatise laid out Locke's vision for a just and free society. In it, he articulated his theory of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, which he saw as fundamental to human existence. He argued that governments existed to protect these rights, and that any government that failed to do so could be justifiably overthrown. These ideas were deeply influenced by Locke's observations of political developments in both England and the Netherlands, where debates over sovereignty and individual freedom were central to political discourse. While in exile, Locke closely followed the events leading up to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The overthrow of James II and the ascension of William of Orange to the English throne confirmed many of his political beliefs. William's acceptance of constitutional limits on his power aligned with Locke's argument that government should be based on the rule of law rather than absolute authority. With the political climate in England shifting in favor of constitutionalism, Locke saw an opportunity to return home and contribute to the new political order. Locke's return to England in 1689 marked the beginning of his most productive period as a writer and thinker. Upon his return, he published an essay concerning human understanding, 2 treatises of government, and a letter concerning toleration, all of which had been developed during his time in exile. These works would become central to Enlightenment thought and inspire future generations of political leaders, philosophers, and revolutionaries. The experience of exile had a profound impact on Locke's thinking. It reinforced his belief in the importance of limited government, individual rights, and religious tolerance. His interactions with Dutch intellectuals exposed him to new ideas on economics, governance, and philosophy, which he integrated into his own work. Moreover, his time away from England allowed him to critically examine the political crises of his homeland from a more detached perspective, leading to more refined and well-reasoned arguments in his writings. One of John Locke's most influential works, an essay concerning human understanding, was the product of years of intellectual refinement and reflection, much of which took place during his exile in the Netherlands. Published in 1689, the essay sought to answer fundamental questions about the nature of human knowledge, the mind, and the processes through which individuals come to understand the world. Locke's work was a direct challenge to prevailing philosophical traditions, particularly those that adhered to rationalist theories of innate ideas and knowledge. His arguments laid the foundation for empiricism, a philosophical movement that emphasized experience and sensory perception as the primary sources of knowledge. Locke's primary aim in the essay was to investigate the origins, limits, and reliability of human understanding. He rejected the long-standing belief that certain ideas were innate, that is, present in the mind from birth. Philosophers such as René Descartes had argued that concepts like morality, logic, and even the idea of God were implanted in human consciousness prior to experience. Locke, however, insisted that the human mind at birth is a tabula rasa, or a blank slate, upon which experience writes all knowledge. According to him, every idea we possess is derived from experience, either through sensation or reflection. To support his argument, Locke divided human knowledge into 2 main sources: sensation and reflection. Sensation refers to the direct input we receive from the external world through our senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. These sensory experiences provide us with basic ideas such as color, texture, and sound. Reflection, on the other hand, is the internal process of thinking, reasoning, and remembering. It allows individuals to analyze their sensory experiences, combine them into more complex ideas, and develop abstract concepts such as justice, beauty, and equality. Locke further distinguished between simple and complex ideas. Simple ideas are the fundamental building blocks of knowledge, formed through direct sensory experience. They cannot be broken down into smaller components, as they are received passively by the mind. Complex ideas, however, are constructed by the mind through combining, comparing, and abstracting simple ideas. For example, the concept of an apple is a complex idea composed of multiple simple ideas, such as its color, shape, and taste. This distinction reinforced Locke's argument that knowledge is not innate, but rather constructed through experience. A key aspect of Locke's epistemology was his discussion of primary and secondary qualities. He argued that primary qualities, such as shape, motion, and solidity, exist independently of human perception and are inherent to objects themselves. In contrast, secondary qualities, such as color, sound, and taste, exist only in the mind of the observer and are dependent on perception. This distinction had significant implications for the philosophy of science, as it suggested that not all perceived qualities of objects correspond to their true nature. Locke also explored the limits of human knowledge, acknowledging that while experience provides the foundation for understanding, it does not grant us absolute certainty. He classified knowledge into three levels: intuitive, demonstrative, and sensitive. Intuitive knowledge is immediate and self-evident, requiring no proof, such as the recognition that a whole is greater than a part. Demonstrative knowledge is based on logical reasoning and deduction, requiring step-by-step proof, as in mathematical theorems. Sensitive knowledge, however, is derived from sensory experience and is less certain because it depends on the reliability of our perceptions. This classification highlighted Locke's recognition of the imperfections and limitations of human understanding. Another major theme of the essay was Locke's theory of personal identity. He proposed that personal identity is not rooted in the substance of the soul or the body, as was traditionally believed, but rather in continuity of consciousness. He argued that a person remains the same individual over time as long as they retain the same memories and self-awareness. This idea was groundbreaking in the philosophy of mind and continues to influence contemporary debates on personal identity and consciousness. The implications of Locke's epistemology extended beyond philosophy into politics, education, and science. His emphasis on experience as the source of knowledge had profound effects on the development of empirical science, reinforcing the scientific method as the best way to investigate the natural world. His rejection of innate ideas also had political consequences, as it undermined traditional justifications for absolute monarchy and hierarchical social structures based on the supposed inherent superiority of certain individuals. If knowledge and virtue were not innate, then all people had the potential to learn and govern themselves. Locke's ideas on education were also deeply influenced by his epistemology. He believed that since the mind begins as a blank slate, education and environment play a crucial role in shaping an individual's character and intellect. He argued for a practical, experience-based approach to education, emphasizing critical thinking, moral development, and real-world application rather than rote memorization of classical texts. His educational philosophy laid the groundwork for modern theories of learning and child development. An essay concerning human understanding was a revolutionary work that redefined how philosophers and scientists approach knowledge, perception, and the human mind. Locke's rejection of innate ideas, his emphasis on experience as the source of all knowledge, and his analysis of personal identity had lasting impacts on philosophy, psychology, and political theory. His work marked the beginning of modern empiricism and significantly influenced later thinkers, including David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and the founders of the Enlightenment. John Locke's two treatises of government, published in 1689, remains one of the most influential works in political philosophy. This work laid the foundation for modern liberal democracy by advocating for the principles of individual rights, limited government, and the social contract. Written as a response to the political turmoil of 17th century England, particularly the Exclusion Crisis and the Glorious Revolution, Locke's arguments provided a philosophical justification for the overthrow of absolute monarchy and the establishment of a constitutional government. His ideas later influenced the American and French revolutions, shaping modern concepts of governance and human rights. The first treatise of government was primarily a refutation of Sir Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, a work that defended the divine right of kings. Filmer had argued that monarchs derive their authority from God, tracing their legitimacy back to Adam, whom he claimed was granted dominion over the earth by divine decree. Locke systematically dismantled this argument, asserting that there was no historical or theological basis for such a claim. He argued that political power should not be inherited or divinely ordained, but must be derived from the consent of the governed. This rejection of absolute monarchy was a radical departure from traditional political thought and laid the groundwork for the democratic ideals that would emerge in later centuries. The second treatise of government presented Locke's vision for a just and legitimate political order. In contrast to Filmer's defense of monarchy, Locke proposed a government based on natural rights and the social contract. He asserted that all individuals are born with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, and property, which governments must protect. These rights, Locke argued, are not granted by rulers, but are inherent to human beings by virtue of their existence. This idea was revolutionary, as it directly challenged the prevailing notion that sovereignty resided in the monarch rather than in the people. Central to Locke's political philosophy was the concept of the state of nature. He described this as a pre-political condition in which individuals exist in a state of perfect freedom and equality. Unlike Thomas Hobbes, who depicted the state of nature as chaotic and violent, Locke believed that people in this state were generally rational and capable of living peacefully. However, he acknowledged that conflicts could arise over resources and property, leading to the need for a government to mediate disputes and enforce laws. According to Locke, individuals enter into a social contract, willingly giving up some of their freedoms in exchange for the protection of their natural rights. Locke's justification for government was based on the principle of consent. He argued that legitimate governments must derive their authority from the consent of the governed, rather than from divine right or hereditary rule. This consent could be either explicit, as in the case of voting and legal agreements, or tacit, as in the case of individuals benefiting from the protections of government. If a government failed to uphold its responsibilities, particularly the protection of life, liberty, and property, Locke maintained that the people had the right to overthrow it. This justification for revolution was particularly significant in the context of 17th century England, where the Glorious Revolution had recently deposed James II in favor of William and Mary. One of Locke's most influential ideas was his theory of property. He argued that individuals have a natural right to own property, which arises from their labor. According to Locke, when a person mixes their labor with natural resources, such as farming land or building a house, they establish ownership over it. However, he introduced the Lockean proviso, which stated that property acquisition was only justifiable if enough resources were left for others. This principle provided an ethical foundation for private property while emphasizing fairness and the common good. His views on property later influenced economic liberalism and capitalist thought, particularly in the works of Adam Smith and other classical economists. Locke also advocated for the separation of powers as a means of preventing tyranny. While he did not develop a detailed system of checks and balances like Montesquieu later would, he emphasized the importance of distinguishing between legislative and executive functions. The legislature, he argued, should be the supreme authority responsible for making laws that reflect the will of the people. The executive, on the other hand, should enforce these laws but remain accountable to the legislative body. This framework laid the foundation for constitutional government and inspired the development of representative democracy. Religious tolerance was another key theme in two treatises of government. Locke argued that the government should not interfere in matters of religion, as faith is a personal matter between individuals and God. He opposed state-enforced religious conformity, which had been a source of conflict in England and throughout Europe. While Locke's views on religious freedom were progressive for his time, they were not entirely universal. He remained skeptical of atheism and was hesitant to extend full tolerance to Catholics, whom he associated with political absolutism. Nevertheless, his arguments contributed to the broader movement toward religious liberty that later shaped modern democratic societies. The impact of Locke's two treatises of government cannot be overstated. His ideas provided a philosophical foundation for constitutionalism, influencing the development of liberal democracies in Britain, America, and beyond. The principles of individual rights, popular sovereignty, and government accountability became central to the American Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, in particular, drew heavily from Locke's theories when drafting the Declaration, replacing Locke's triad of life, liberty, and property with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke's contributions to religious tolerance were as groundbreaking as his political philosophy. His work, A Letter Concerning Toleration, published in 1689, laid the foundation for the modern understanding of religious freedom and the separation of church and state. At a time when Europe was still plagued by religious conflicts, state-imposed doctrines, and persecution of dissenters, Locke's arguments provided a rational and philosophical defense of religious liberty. His vision influenced the development of secular governance and the expansion of religious tolerance in Western societies, particularly in Britain and the American colonies. Locke's advocacy for religious tolerance was deeply connected to his broader philosophical and political beliefs. He viewed religion as a matter of personal conscience rather than state control. According to Locke, the role of government was to protect life, liberty, and property, not to regulate individuals' spiritual beliefs. He believed that faith could not be forced upon individuals and that genuine religious belief must come from free will rather than coercion. This stance was a direct challenge to the prevailing system in many European nations, where monarchs and political leaders dictated religious orthodoxy, punishing dissenters who refused to conform. One of Locke's central arguments was that religious diversity was inevitable and that no single authority could claim absolute truth. He recognized that people had different interpretations of religious doctrines and that enforcing uniformity through state power would only lead to oppression and conflict. In his view, attempts to impose religious conformity were both morally unjust and practically ineffective, as they did not lead to true belief, but rather to hypocrisy and resentment. By advocating for a society in which multiple religious perspectives could coexist peacefully, Locke laid the groundwork for the pluralistic societies we see today. Locke also made a strong case for the separation of church and state. He argued that religious institutions and political authorities had distinct roles and that mixing them led to corruption and tyranny. Governments, he asserted, should be concerned with the material and civil interests of society, such as the protection of property and public order, while religious institutions should focus on spiritual matters. He warned that when governments took on the role of religious enforcers, they often resorted to persecution, suppressing freedom of thought and expression. Likewise, when religious leaders gained political power, they tended to impose their own beliefs on society, undermining individual liberty. However, Locke's vision of tolerance was not absolute. While he argued that most religious groups should be granted freedom of worship, he made notable exceptions for atheists and Catholics. He believed that atheists could not be trusted because they did not acknowledge a higher moral authority, which he thought was essential for maintaining social order. Additionally, he distrusted Catholics, viewing their allegiance to the Pope as a potential threat to the stability of Protestant England. These exclusions reveal the limitations of Locke's tolerance, reflecting the political and religious tensions of his time. Nevertheless, his ideas marked a significant step toward broader religious freedom. Locke's arguments for religious tolerance were not merely theoretical. They had direct political implications. The late 17th century was a period of intense religious conflict in England and across Europe, with tensions between Catholics, Anglicans, Puritans, and other Protestant sections. The English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution had demonstrated the dangers of religiously motivated political disputes. Locke's writings provided intellectual support for policies that aimed to reduce sectarian violence and establish a more stable and peaceful society. His influence can be seen in the Toleration Act of 1689, which granted some religious freedoms to nonconformist Protestants, though it fell short of full religious equality. Beyond England, Locke's ideas on religious tolerance had a profound impact on the development of American political thought. Many of the early American settlers were religious dissenters seeking freedom from persecution in Europe. The principles of religious liberty enshrined in the U.S. Constitution and the First Amendment were heavily influenced by Locke's arguments. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, in particular, drew upon his work in crafting policies that ensured religious freedom and the separation of church and state in the United States. Locke's vision also influenced later Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu, who expanded on his ideas in advocating for broader religious freedom and secular governance. Voltaire, for instance, famously criticized religious intolerance in France, using Locke's reasoning to argue that a just society must protect diverse beliefs. Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, further developed the idea that religious tolerance was essential for political stability and justice. Through these thinkers, Locke's ideas continued to shape the evolution of liberal democracy in Europe and beyond. Despite the progress inspired by Locke's work, religious tolerance remains a contested issue in many parts of the world today. The balance between religious freedom and state authority continues to be debated, particularly in societies where religious and secular values clash. Locke's insights remain relevant in contemporary discussions about the rights of religious minorities, the role of religion in public life, and the limits of governmental authority over individual beliefs. His assertion that true faith cannot be imposed by force and that government should remain neutral in matters of religion continues to serve as a guiding principle in legal and political debates. John Locke's contributions to education were as significant as his political and philosophical writings. His work Some Thoughts Concerning Education, published in 1693, laid the groundwork for modern educational theory and practice. Locke's views on education were deeply influenced by his epistemological principles, particularly his belief that the human mind begins as a tabula rasa, blank slate, and that all knowledge is derived from experience. This perspective led him to advocate for an educational system that emphasized experiential learning, critical thinking, and the development of character. His ideas on education not only shaped pedagogical theories during the Enlightenment, but continue to influence contemporary education systems worldwide. At the heart of Locke's educational philosophy was the idea that education should be tailored to the individual learner. He rejected the rigid and authoritarian teaching methods that were common in his time, which relied heavily on rote memorization and corporal punishment. Instead, Locke proposed a more holistic approach that emphasized intellectual curiosity, moral development, and the cultivation of practical skills. He believed that learning should be an enjoyable process rather than a burdensome obligation, arguing that children learn best when they are engaged and motivated by their own interests. Locke placed significant emphasis on the importance of early childhood education. He believed that the habits and values instilled in children during their formative years would shape their character and intelligence for the rest of their lives. According to him, education was not merely about imparting knowledge, but also about developing a child's ability to reason and think independently. He argued that children should be encouraged to question, analyze, and form their own judgments rather than passively accept information from authority figures. This emphasis on critical thinking became a foundational principle in modern educational theory. In addition to intellectual development, Locke stressed the importance of physical well-being in education. He believed that a sound body was essential for a sound mind and advocated for a balanced lifestyle that included exercise, proper diet, and sufficient rest. He criticized the overuse of strict disciplinary measures, suggesting instead that children should be guided with patience and encouragement. Locke's views on child rearing and education were remarkably progressive for his time, as they promoted a more humane and respectful approach to teaching. One of Locke's most influential ideas was his emphasis on practical education. He argued that education should be relevant to real life and that students should be taught subjects and skills that would be useful in their personal and professional lives. He favored the teaching of mathematics, history, science, and languages, but also emphasized moral education and the cultivation of virtues such as honesty, diligence, and perseverance. This practical approach to education laid the groundwork for later movements that prioritized applied knowledge over purely theoretical learning. Locke also addressed the issue of social class in education. In his time, formal education was largely reserved for the wealthy elite, while the lower classes had limited access to learning. Although Locke primarily wrote for an audience of aristocratic and upper-class families, he suggested that education should be more widely accessible and that the benefits of learning should not be restricted to a privileged few. His belief in the potential for intellectual development in all individuals contributed to later educational reforms aimed at expanding access to schooling. Furthermore, Locke's views on education had a profound influence on the development of democratic societies. He believed that education was essential for cultivating informed and responsible citizens who could actively participate in governance. His emphasis on rationality, independent thought, and moral responsibility aligned with his broader political philosophy, which championed individual rights and self-government. These ideas would later inspire thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson, who advocated for public education as a means of strengthening democracy. Locke's impact on educational theory extended beyond philosophy into practical pedagogy. His ideas influenced the development of progressive education movements, including those led by John Dewey in the 19th and 20th centuries. Dewey's emphasis on experiential learning and student-centered education can be traced back to Locke's advocacy for active engagement and real-world application in learning. Similarly, modern educational methods that prioritize critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving reflect Locke's vision of education as a dynamic and interactive process. Despite his progressive views, Locke's educational philosophy was not without limitations. His writings were primarily addressed to an elite audience, and he did not fully challenge the social hierarchies that limited access to education for women and lower-class individuals. Although he believed that women should receive some education, he did not advocate for full equality in educational opportunities. Additionally, while his ideas encouraged greater autonomy for students, they still assumed a degree of paternalistic guidance from educators and parents. John Locke's influence extends far beyond the 17th century, shaping the development of political philosophy, education, and human rights well into the modern era. His ideas on government, natural rights, religious tolerance, and education provided the foundation for many of the democratic institutions and liberal principles that define contemporary societies. The enduring relevance of his work is evident in the philosophical debates, legal systems, and political movements that continue to draw upon his theories. From the American and French revolutions to the modern discussions on individual liberty and constitutional democracy, Locke's intellectual legacy remains a guiding force in shaping the modern world. One of Locke's most significant contributions was his role in shaping liberal democracy. His theory of government, articulated in 2 treatises of government, established the principles of popular sovereignty, limited government, and the rule of law. These ideas directly influenced the political systems of nations such as the United States, Great Britain, and France. The American founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, drew heavily from Locke's arguments when drafting the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. His emphasis on natural rights, life, liberty, and property became the foundation of the American Bill of Rights and the broader principles of human freedom and justice. Similarly, Locke's influence was strongly felt during the French Revolution. His ideas about government as a social contract, in which rulers derive their authority from the consent of the governed, inspired the revolutionary push against absolute monarchy in France. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted in 1789, reflected Locke's philosophy by affirming individual liberties and the principle of government accountability. While the French Revolution took a more radical turn than Locke might have envisioned, his advocacy for representative government and the protection of rights helped shape the democratic ideals that followed. Beyond political revolutions, Locke's legacy also extends to legal philosophy and human rights. His work provided the intellectual foundation for the concept of constitutional government, where power is limited by laws designed to protect individual freedoms. The notion that laws should serve the people, rather than the ruling elite, became a core principle of modern legal systems. Today, constitutional democracies around the world reflect Locke's ideas by upholding principles such as due process, the separation of powers, and the protection of civil liberties. His influence is particularly evident in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which embodies the Lockean vision of fundamental human freedoms. Locke's impact was not limited to the realm of politics and law. His contributions to epistemology and education continue to shape contemporary thought. His argument that knowledge is derived from experience, as outlined in an essay concerning human understanding, laid the foundation for empiricism and the scientific method. By rejecting the idea of innate knowledge and emphasizing the role of observation and reason, Locke helped establish the principles that would later guide thinkers such as David Hume and Immanuel Kant. His epistemological framework remains central to modern discussions on the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and psychology. In the field of education, Locke's ideas continue to inform pedagogical approaches that prioritize student engagement and experiential learning. His belief that children learn best through experience and reflection is reflected in modern educational theories that emphasize active learning, problem-solving, and critical thinking. Progressive education movements, such as those championed by John Dewey in the 20th century, build upon Locke's vision by promoting inquiry-based learning and democratic classrooms. The widespread adoption of student-centered teaching methods in schools today is a testament to the lasting relevance of Locke's educational philosophy. Locke's advocacy for religious tolerance also continues to shape contemporary debates on freedom of belief and the role of religion in public life. His argument that governments should not impose religious conformity remains a cornerstone of secularism and religious pluralism. Many democratic societies today uphold the principle of religious freedom, ensuring that individuals have the right to practice or not practice any faith without fear of persecution. While Locke's views on tolerance were not entirely inclusive, particularly in his exclusion of atheists and Catholics, his broader argument for the separation of church and state laid the foundation for modern policies that protect religious diversity. Despite his profound contributions, Locke's philosophy has not been without criticism. Some scholars argue that his theories on property rights and government consent were shaped by the political and economic interests of the rising bourgeois class, making them less applicable to contemporary challenges such as economic inequality and corporate power. Others criticize his views on colonialism, as Locke was indirectly involved in colonial enterprises that contradicted his ideals of universal human rights. These critiques highlight the complexities of applying Locke's philosophy in an ever-evolving world, yet they also invite ongoing dialogue about the meaning of liberty and justice in modern society. Locke's influence has also been challenged by later philosophical movements, including socialism and communitarianism, which question the emphasis on individualism in his work. Thinkers such as Karl Marx criticized Locke's defense of private property, arguing that it contributed to social and economic inequalities. Similarly, communitarian philosophers have questioned whether Locke's focus on individual rights sufficiently accounts for the role of communities and social responsibilities in shaping human well-being. These debates demonstrate the enduring relevance of Locke's work, as his ideas continue to be reinterpreted and critiqued in response to new societal challenges. John Locke's intellectual contributions, though originating in the 17th century, continue to resonate with contemporary thought and policy. His ideas on individual liberty, government, property, education, and religious tolerance have laid the foundation for modern liberal democracies and have had a lasting influence on political and philosophical movements around the world. In the 21st century, Locke's work remains central to debates about governance, rights, and the role of the state in the lives of citizens. His legacy endures not only in political theory, but also in the evolving challenges facing modern societies. As such, it is valuable to reflect on Locke's relevance today and how his ideas continue to shape the world. One of the key reasons Locke's work endures is the universality of his principles. Locke's emphasis on individual rights, particularly the right to life, liberty, and property, remains foundational to the concept of human dignity in modern legal systems. In a world increasingly characterized by globalization, technology, and shifting political landscapes, Locke's vision of personal freedom provides a philosophical framework for addressing contemporary issues such as privacy, freedom of expression, and the protection of minority rights. His focus on the importance of securing personal liberties against state intrusion has been a central theme in discussions about civil rights movements, as well as in legal battles surrounding issues like surveillance, data privacy, and government overreach. Locke's ideas on government and the social contract are equally relevant in the 21st century. His theory that government is instituted to protect the natural rights of individuals has been a guiding principle for democratic systems worldwide. The concept of consent of the governed, central to Locke's theory, is embedded in the foundational documents of modern democracies, such as the U.S. Constitution and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. In today's world, where questions about the legitimacy of government power and the balance between authority and personal freedom are increasingly urgent, Locke's belief in limited government and checks on power remains a critical reference point. His warnings about the dangers of absolute monarchy and tyranny are echoed in modern concerns about authoritarianism and the erosion of democratic institutions in various parts of the globe. Furthermore, Locke's emphasis on the separation of powers continues to influence the structure of contemporary governments. His theory that legislative, executive, and judicial powers should be separate to prevent abuses of authority is a cornerstone of many democratic constitutions. The ongoing global conversation about the role of the judiciary, executive overreach, and legislative accountability reflects Locke's concerns about the concentration of power. In recent years, the rise of populist movements and challenges to democratic norms in both established and emerging democracies have renewed interest in Locke's insights on the need for institutional safeguards and the preservation of the rule of law. Locke's advocacy for religious tolerance and the separation of church and state remains particularly significant in today's world, where religious pluralism and the intersection of religion and politics continue to be contentious issues. Locke's argument that government should not impose religious beliefs or interfere with personal faith is a key tenet of secularism, which is increasingly vital in a multicultural world. The right to religious freedom is enshrined in international law, such as in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Locke's work continues to inform debates on issues like religious expression, minority rights, and the role of religion in public life. At a time when religious extremism and conflicts rooted in religious differences remain pressing concerns, Locke's vision of a society where individuals are free to follow their own religious convictions offers a path to coexistence and peace. In the realm of education, Locke's ideas about learning as an active, experience-based process resonate with contemporary pedagogical movements that emphasize critical thinking, problem-solving, and creativity. In an era dominated by technological advancements and information overload, Locke's emphasis on intellectual development through personal experience and reason remains highly relevant. His belief in the importance of early childhood education and the development of a child's character continues to influence modern educational systems that prioritize holistic, student-centered approaches. Moreover, Locke's rejection of authoritarian educational methods in favor of fostering curiosity and independent thought is echoed in today's educational reforms that aim to create more inclusive, engaging, and democratic classrooms. While Locke's ideas continue to hold great significance, it is important to acknowledge the limitations and contradictions within his philosophy, especially in light of contemporary critiques. For instance, Locke's views on property and colonialism have been subject to scrutiny, particularly in regard to his involvement with the British colonial enterprise. His justification for the accumulation of private property and his theories about land ownership have been criticized for failing to account for the unequal distribution of resources and the exploitation of indigenous populations. These critiques raise important questions about how Locke's ideas can be applied in a world where wealth inequality and the legacy of colonialism persist. In addition, Locke's exclusion of women and certain religious groups from his vision of equality remains a point of contention. While Locke's political philosophy advocated for the protection of individual rights, his ideas on gender and religious tolerance were often limited by the norms and prejudices of his time. His views on women's education and their role in society were restrictive, and his exclusion of Catholics and atheists from the benefits of religious freedom highlights the contradictions in his otherwise progressive vision of tolerance. These aspects of Locke's thought demonstrate that his philosophy, like all philosophies, must be understood in its historical context, even as it provides a framework for addressing contemporary issues. Despite these limitations, Locke's work has had an undeniable impact on the development of liberal thought and democratic values. His insistence on the importance of individual freedom, limited government, and the protection of natural rights continues to serve as a touchstone for political and legal discussions today. As societies continue to grapple with issues of democracy, justice, and equality, Locke's legacy remains a powerful influence in shaping debates about the role of the state, the protection of rights, and the meaning of liberty. John Locke's relevance in the 21st century is clear. His contributions to political philosophy, epistemology, education, and religious tolerance have left an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape. While his ideas have been critiqued and revised in light of new developments, they continue to inform contemporary discussions on governance, human rights, and education. As the world faces new challenges, ranging from the rise of authoritarianism to the challenges of a globalized, interconnected world, Locke's vision of a just society based on individual rights, democratic principles, and reason remains as vital today as it was in his own time. His legacy endures not only as a historical figure, but as a living influence on the ideals of liberty and justice that continue to shape the future.